Welcome. This is Conversations with Marsha, sponsored by The Great Connections. The Great Connections is an educational organization for young people which has innovative and transformative programs. We help them build lives of adventure and achievement. I'm Marsha Familaro-Enright, the program director. And in Conversations with Marsha, today we're going to talk to Diana Smith Butler, a longtime Montessori expert. If you like our conversations, please hit the bell and subscribe, and visit our website at thegreatconnections.org. So, Diana, welcome. We're so glad to have you today.
It's a pleasure to be here, Marsha.
Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. Diana is the founding directress of Montessori School, which I founded with two other women and Diana in 1990. That's one of the main ways that I know of her deep understanding of the Montessori method and her brilliant ability to articulate what the ideas are about. She was a Montessori teacher for ages between 3 and 12 for 33 years and a trainer of teachers at the Montessori Education Institute of the Pacific Northwest for 22 years. She has a master's in education from the University of Washington, and her Montessori training certificates are from the Institute for Advanced Montessori Studies in Silver Springs and Seton Montessori Institute in Clarendon Hills, Illinois. Her thesis for her master's degree was Right Where They Are Right Now, Formative Assessment in Montessori Lower Elementary Classrooms. And it won a first place prize at the American Montessori Society. Now, her thesis includes one of the topics I want to talk about today. But let's start out first by finding out a little bit more about Diana. Diana, how did you decide to become a Montessori teacher?
Well, you know, it's funny when you look back at your life and you see all these various threads that came together. When I was a freshman at Seattle University, a woman that I knew handed me a book and said, "Here, I think you will like this." She had been a teacher of mine when I was in 7th and 8th grade. And the book was Maria Montessori, Her Life and Work by E. Mortimer Standing.
It's a great introduction.
It was a fantastic introduction. Yeah. I was mesmerized. I was just enchanted at the possibilities for education for children and for the way that children's true spirits could blossom in this new kind of, new to America kind of education. And then when I ran into Montessori here and there along the way, I had a chance to visit one of the very first Montessori schools that was established in the Pacific Northwest, that was in Portland, Oregon, and saw these little tiny girls sitting on little tiny toilets, having a conversation with each other, no adults anywhere around, and just like so in charge of their own being that it was fascinating. There were no adults standing around telling them what to do and how to do it. So when my first child was around 2, somebody established a toddler program in near where we lived, and we enrolled her. And my husband and I thought, oh, this is great. She's going to be 2 hours every Saturday off. We're going to go get coffee and go for a walk and all that. No, I started sitting in this toddler class every Saturday, just mesmerized. And the flip side of that was when I did my student teaching at around the same time in a traditional school, I had always wanted to be a teacher since I was in kindergarten. And when I did my student teaching, my heart was broken that I could not serve the needs of half the children in that class using conventional educational methods. Every time I was up in front of that class, I knew I was missing the children who were struggling, the 25% who were struggling, and the 25% who were bored to tears. And I finished my student teaching going out of there vowing I was never going to set foot in another classroom until I could find a way to meet the needs of all of the children. And so when I got a chance to take Montessori teacher training after my daughter was older and was enrolled then in a Montessori preschool, and I saw this in action, and I got a chance to take my own Montessori teacher training, I found it really was true that in a Montessori classroom, the needs of pretty much all the children can be met more or less successfully, more or less most of the time. Um, and it was just very satisfying because the needs of the children in Montessori are not just considered to be their academic needs, but the development of the whole person. And it seems to me that if we're going to spend that much time and energy on children, we need to be developing them as whole human beings, not as little automatons who can spout facts and pass tests. That does not benefit humanity. It doesn't benefit society. I'm not interested in that narrow a focus. Montessori has as its focus the development of the whole person, whether it's a toddler or a person in taking teacher training, him or herself. It's about the whole person.
And it doesn't benefit the individual either.
Right, right.
Yeah. What do you mean by it addresses the whole person?
Well, you know, I'm going to kind of come at that from a different angle. Maria Montessori said the first duty of the teacher is to develop herself or himself. It's to root out their own defects. And the reason is because when we come into a relationship with a student, we have as a goal to help them develop their whole person. And as teachers, we have to be working on developing ourselves as whole people. It's the social, the emotional, the cognitive, the all those pieces, the physical, all those pieces coming together that gives us a human being who's ready and excited about meeting the challenges that life is going to throw at them. Does that make sense?
Sure, sure. So you mean you'll help the child develop so they know how to move through the classroom and interact with other people well, and if they have a conflict, how to resolve it with another child. If they have things disturbing them from their personal life, emotionally disturbing them, and it's interfering with their learning, then you are able to you work on helping them deal with that. These are the kinds of things you mean, isn't it?
Yes. So Montessori is a very intellectual approach, but it's undergirded. You know, if you think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? We have to have our physical needs met, and then we have to be secure as human beings, and then we can start working on the more abstract intellectual prefrontal cortex kinds of things that are involved in learning. So when we address the child's social needs, we are helping them to learn how to get along with one another in the classroom, how to introduce oneself, how to welcome somebody. You know, Maria Montessori had this famous lesson where she taught them how to blow their nose. Yeah. They were mesmerized. No one had taught them how to blow their nose. They just yelled at the children for wiping their nose on their sleeve. Mm-hmm. They clapped for her when she met this deep felt, unarticulated need of theirs. So Montessori teachers are very cognizant of the need for those kinds of lessons. And there's the Montessori term is often grace and courtesy. Mm-hmm. And then in the emotional area, if children are, as you say, having trouble getting along in the classroom, a lot of times what they need is to be given the language for what's going on and then allowed to practice it, not in a punitive kind of a way, not in a you say you're sorry kind of way, but in a way that really deepens the relationship between the people who are having a conflict and allows them to sort of feel each other's hearts and work in that space rather than, you know, parroting some sort of words. Maria Montessori's goal wasn't to develop little children who read and write at the age of, and did math at the age of 4, which is pretty impressive, pretty fun, actually not that hard to do. Her goal was world peace. And in that way, I think of Montessori as kind of a guerrilla activity because people think it's about producing very bright children who can do all of these things. And that's all true. But what she was really after, having lived through World War I and the Spanish Civil War and World War II, what she was after was producing people who knew how to be peaceful. And that is a very important part of the work of a Montessori classroom.
And this conflict resolution, where you help the child learn what they're feeling and what the other person is feeling and why they're clashing, then they understanding each other so that they can come to some kind of resolution.
Exactly.
And what was it? Can you give us an example of a typical conversation about something like this? Like, is there a typical conflict that two children might get into, and then you as a teacher, how would you guide them to resolve it?
Good question. It's so much an in the moment thing. It's, and I haven't been a classroom teacher, to tell you the truth, in a number of years, but typical arguments happen on the playground. And so it's not unusual for two children to come in from recess and they've been having an argument, and one of them maybe is crying. And so to bring the two children together and be with them, and to realize as the adult that we don't have somebody who's right and somebody who's wrong here. We have two children who are upset and who each have their own point of view that to them within themselves makes a certain kind of sense. And so by having an attitude of validating the children from the start, I think you get a lot farther.
Mhm.
And then typically, I think a teacher would start by asking the student who's upset, can you tell us what you're upset about? And they pretty much get to talk until they're done.
Mhm.
And then you look at the other child and say, oh, did you hear that?
Mhm.
Oh, okay. Can you say that back in your own words? Can you tell me what you think Brian said there? Okay, good. Brian, did that sound pretty much like what you're saying? No, something's not quite right. Oh, tell us. Okay.
Mhm.
All right. Now, can you say back what Brian said? Now do you think you get it? Okay, good. Now, Anna, let's call her. Anna, tell us how you're feeling. What happened from your point of view? And so Anna gets to say, well, he always and he never and whatever it is.
Mhm.
And then Brian gets to say what he thinks Anna's point of view is. And somewhere in this kind of an interaction, what happens is the children's shoulders go down, their faces start to relax. They start to hear each other. Frankly, sometimes, and this is something I used to hope for, is they get kind of bored with the whole process. And it's like, can we be done? Can we be done now? We want to go get our geometry done. Anna, you want to go work on geometry? Yeah. Let's get out of here. So,
And they go off together.
And they go off together. Yeah. But
Yeah.
Anna has a reason why she was mad. Brian has a reason why he's mad. And when they can each talk about it and really feel heard, it's much more possible to get to some sort of a resolution.
It reminds me so much of the recommendations in that book, How to Talk So Kids Will Listen and Listen So Kids Will Talk, right?
Yes.
By Faber and Meslish, which we'll
Yes.
put that in the program notes for people.
And I think it's the books that I recommend to teachers and to parents around helping children with conflict, around figuring out how to raise children, are the books by Jane Nelson on which grow out of the work of Alfred Adler and Rudolf Dreikurs. And I'm drawing a blank on the name of those. Positive Discipline.
Yeah, we'll put information in the.
It's the positive, all the positive discipline work has been used in its various iterations over decades by Montessorians, because it just fits beautifully with Montessori. It's non-jargony. And the point of view toward the child is the same, this complete respect for the child. So I found it invaluable.
So that's an example of one part of the curriculum that is not the academic part, but which is very important to the development of the person and to actually the quietude in the child so that they can focus on the intellectual things.
Exactly.
Because if
One
they
of
have
the,
emotional things going on, it's very difficult to pay attention to geometry.
it's impossible. It's impossible. It's breaking the child into pieces and requiring them to ignore the central fact of their being. And in Montessori, we're very much about, I kind of want to say all about putting the child in touch with their own being and getting them to recognize when they're in touch and to trust that, to know that that is where the knowing is. So it starts with the very young, even in the infant class, it starts with the infants when the teachers in the infant class watch the infants for the sign that the baby is hungry.
Mhm.
The baby is sleepy. It's not that we always eat at 8:30 in the morning and we always take our naps at 10. It's when is this child needing this thing? And that goes all the way through, because that is the point. Actually, it's kind of like, on the Sistine Chapel, the finger of God and the finger of Adam, that point of the felt need being met, that's where the magic happens. If the need is of the teacher to impart knowledge and the child has no need to absorb it, there's no magic. There's just drudgery.
Mhm. And when you say the magic, what do you mean by that?
Mm. It's when the connection happens. It's when the child becomes attached. Maria Montessori said, when a child finds a work that they're interested in or finds something that they're interested in and becomes attached to it, she literally said, then they are safe. Because they have something outside of themselves that fascinates them, that calls them out from themselves to learn and become involved in the world. So the real magic in a classroom is when, and I'm thinking now of particularly of lower elementary, but really it can happen in any classroom all the way up through adults. The magic is when all of the people in the classroom are engaged in learning that is meaningful to them at the moment simultaneously. And then there is a spirit in the classroom. There is like, the light almost shimmers in the classroom. And it can go on for, so for a few minutes, for several minutes, it can go on for a couple hours. And then when the time is over, the feeling is kind of like, people look up and look around and kind of remember, where they are. And there's a feeling of refreshment and of joy and of accomplishment. And certainly that does not happen all the time. Some days, I've been known to go into my principal and say, I need combat pay today because this is a very, very tough day.
Yeah.
But when those moments happen, they're worth everything. And I always think that they go inside the learner and create something in there, create a knowing and a confidence and an energy. Maria Montessori talks about lighting the fires of imagination. And my experience is once those fires of imagination and those fires of knowing and trusting the inside of yourself, once those fires are lit, it would be very, very difficult to extinguish them.
Well, it's funny. You exactly described what's called a flow experience.
Yes, that's right. Right.
Exactly. If anybody is interested in this, it's from the researcher Csikszentmihalyi, and you can read about in his books about what he says a flow experience is like. This is when you are totally engaged in an activity, so that you just forget your surroundings, you forget what time it is, and you're in immense enjoyment in what you're doing, and you come out of it and you feel refreshed and you have a real sense of accomplishment. Exactly. You described it exactly.
That's exactly right. Csikszentmihalyi has done some wonderful work, including work on flow in Montessori junior high, middle school programs. And Maria Montessori, she didn't use the word flow, but that's exactly what she's talking about. She calls it concentration. And adults experience this if you have a hobby and you paint or you work on motorcycle engines or what, and you just get in it and time just goes and you are finished and you look up and you're startled at how long how much time has passed. And that's what we're talking about. And Maria Montessori said, when a child has found something and is interested in concentrating, let them be.
Mhm.
Do not interrupt them. This is the holy grail for Montessori teachers. And it's one of the things we observe for the most keenly.
Well, and certainly having the ability to concentrate on work like that is a critical element of real achievement. All the people who are super achievers, who are incredibly creative, they will describe themselves as getting into that kind of, as wanting to get into that kind of experience to do their work. So we know that this is just fantastic to really nurture that in children, and then they can carry that throughout their career into adulthood and use it in their work.
Exactly. And if their education has not prepared them for flow, for the flow experience, for that peak experience, it's much more difficult for them to imagine that such a thing is possible. They have to accidentally come upon it in some other
Mhm.
avenue or area of their life. But if they know it's possible, and it's possible on a routine basis, and they know the hallmarks and how to get there, they are much more likely to have that in their life going forward. And you're right, that's where creativity comes from. That's where all the great ideas come from. That's it.
And it's interesting how many of the exceptional founders of companies today were Montessori students. I remember, it must be 20 years ago now, Barbara Walters was interviewing Larry Page and Sergey Brin, the founders of Google, and
Yes.
they met each other in graduate school. They were both uh, children of professors. And so Barbara said, well, is it because you have these great academic backgrounds that you're so creative and you've done this? And they said, no, we've talked about this. And we both think it's because we both went to Montessori school, and that we were allowed to follow our interests in Montessori school and really intensely concentrate on them. And there's others too, Bezos from Amazon, um, Anne Frank from
Yes.
Diary of Anne Frank,
Yes.
Julia Child, who
Yes.
innovated on French cooking. Just there's an incredible number of people like this who were Montessori students. Um, so how does this all relate to learning academics? Or what about academic, like learning math and reading and science in Montessori?
Well, I think when a student is feeling that they're in a community that values them, their mind is freed up to look at, to concentrate on academics.
Mhm.
Now, it's not an either, like we don't make the community and everybody feels nice and now we're going to look at the math. It's a process. It,
Mhm.
it all happens together. It's all interwoven. Um, so teachers look at whatever level of student they're teaching. They assess, almost always informally through observation, where a student is and what they might be interested in. And then they start offering in all the areas of the academic curriculum. They start offering this lesson and that lesson, and can I show you this, and how would you like to learn about that? And um, eventually something hooks the child and they start, and then the teacher starts taking notes on how the child is doing the work, if it seems too easy for them, if it looks too difficult, if it looks like they need another lesson, did they choose the work again? And then when it's obvious to the teacher that, or at least he or she strongly suspects that the child has kind of mined this particular activity, then they invite the child to have another lesson on something that's a little bit more difficult. And so the whole thing just unfolds. In preschool, children are more individualistic, and the lessons that are given are almost always just to one child at a time. But by the time children hit first grade, they've developed into a different kind of a human being. They're much more social. And so one of the hooks for children is to tell them that, oh, we're going to get so and so and so and so, and we're all going to learn this together. And they're not real thrilled about the topic necessarily, but they like so and so and so and so. So the idea
Mhm.
of getting together with them enhances their readiness and their willingness
Mhm.
to learn.
And then part of this is that there's these brilliantly designed materials that are kind of like games. That's the closest that we can really compare them to, that are kind of like games that teach different concepts that we want the children to learn, whether it's in mathematics or it's in language or botany, biology, history. And the materials are created to be, to what she said, call to the child, really interest them, they attract them, and they show them a part of the concept that's just enough for them to be working on and grasp, and then they can go on to the next thing. So this is all part of the magic of what happens in a Montessori classroom.
And you allude to a concept that another educational philosopher, Lev Vygotsky, talks about, and he uses the word scaffolding, where he talks about that knowing where the student is and what they're ready for, and then building that next rung of the ladder up. Maria Montessori called it the appropriate degree of difficulty. And the materials themselves are a huge part of the genius of Maria Montessori. She invented material after material, work after work that does what Harvey Hallenberg calls materializing the abstractions. So some of the abstractions that are materialized are things like types of angles and types of quadrilaterals and parts of speech and all kinds of other things. And if you can think of it and you can figure out a way to make a material that's very game-like, children can learn incredible amounts of things. And one of the hallmarks of these materials, that Maria Montessori, being a scientist, she knew a lot about control of error. She knew not to conduct an experiment that had too many variables in it. And so each one of these materials is carefully designed to teach one thing, particularly in preschool. By the time the children get into elementary school and things, academics are more complicated, the materials have more possibilities. But there's a way in these materials where if the child makes a mistake while they're learning, the material itself doesn't work. It's like when you're putting together a puzzle and you have a piece and you think it's right, but it just kind of won't go in there. That's the way these materials are. And they intrigue the intellect and get children just sort of hooked on finding the answers. And the teachers are watching. If the teacher sees a child is becoming too frustrated, she may go over and ask, would you like a little bit of help? Looks like you're kind of struggling with this. Sometimes the child will say, no, I'll figure it out. And sometimes the child will willingly accept help. So we're not just leaving kids to struggle endlessly on their own, but these materials with their control of error are brilliantly designed, beautifully made out of beautiful materials, and academically, correct. So they're treasures.
And we can put in the notes some links to videos and pictures of what these materials are like, in case the audience is interested in seeing them. I wanted to move on to the question of assessment, which you covered in your thesis. And the thesis was about summative versus formative assessment. Could you explain to us what that is, what these are?
Yes. So summative and formative assessment are two important words in education these days. They capture the two ways that we have of knowing what learners know. And also, if we want to use that information of what they know, we can use it to plan what they need to learn next. So in education traditionally, we think about how it was when we were in school and when our parents were in school, and all what the assessment that was being done, the figuring out what the child knows, the learner knows, was done with paper and pencil tests. So we had spelling tests, we had math tests, we had end of chapter tests, we had test. It was all paper and pencil, and you either did it well or you didn't, and then there was a mark in the book, and then typically in a class, no matter what your mark was, the class went on. You got 100% on everything and you were bored out of your mind, and the class was on the same page no matter what, or you got 19% and you were completely lost and the class went on. So that's summative assessment. It's actually very useful for finding out what people know. For instance, if you want a driver's license, you want to be able to drive a car, you take a summative assessment test. Somebody gets in a car with you and they find out if you actually learned how to drive a car or not. Or for any kinds of, licensing exams for doctors take summative assessment exams. They have their place.
Mhm.
But formative assessment is the type of assessment that has been used throughout human history by people who knew something to teach to somebody else. And what they're looking for is what does the learner know already?
Mhm.
And where are they in their learning process? And what can I do to help them learn the very next thing they need to know?
Mhm.
So if you had a grandmother who taught you how to cross stitch, she watched how you held the needle and she watched how you put it in and all those kinds of things. Um, you can apply that to, making arrowheads or any other task you can think of. The master helped the student by watching. And the key to this whole thing is observation. Now, the idea of formative assessment has also been broadened to include the idea of students doing their own formative assessment, looking at their own learning and figuring out what's working and what's not working and where they need help. And it's also been broadened to include students assessing each other's works. But it's all about what's going on in the moment and what comes next. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
And it's also done in an atmosphere generally that's kind of another term that gets used is low stakes, where it's done in an atmosphere where what the teacher finds out is not used against the student. It's used to help the student
Mhm.
understand what the goal is, understand what the next steps are, and just check for student understanding in
Mhm.
general and help them plot the next thing.
Mhm. Can you give us an example of formative assessment in a classroom?
Sure. So, say I'm teaching a lower elementary class, and a student brings me a rough draft that they've of some piece of writing that they've produced. I look at the rough draft. Now, I've been children's work. The work that they produce is just gold in terms of revealing the processes that are going on in their minds, what they know, what they don't know, where they need to go. So if I look at this rough draft, first of all, I'm remembering other rough drafts and finished products that I've seen from this child. And so I'm assessing, like, is this getting better?
Mhm.
Are they kind of plateauing? Is it not up to their best standards? And then I am looking for remembering whatever the goal of the work is. How well are they progressing toward the goal? And then in seeing in the ways where there's mistakes being made, I'm making choices about which of these mistakes we're going to concentrate on. Because to concentrate on every single mistake that a young learner has made it's ridiculous. All it does is make people feel overwhelmed.
Mhm.
So what I may do with a student is to say, I noticed this and I noticed that. So I noticed that you've got some words in here that you could spell conventionally
Mhm.
or not. And I also noticed that your paragraph here is a little unclear to me as a reader.
Mhm.
So which of those two things would you care to work on?
Mhm.
Now, there we are asking the child to look inside themselves. Usually they're going to care a lot more about the fact that I, as a reader, didn't get the idea that they have. That's what I'm hoping that they care more
Yeah,
about.
right.
And so then we can have a conversation about what it is that I, as a reader, don't quite understand, and what I, as a reader, kind of was looking for, kind of
Mhm.
wish was in here. I wish that you had maybe included that and maybe that. Does
Mhm.
that make sense to you?
Mhm.
That makes sense. Okay, good. Go work on that and then get back to me
Mhm.
on it. So, that's pretty much how it goes. And when I did my research, part of what I did that was so interesting to me was I watched teachers with their students during the work period where those kinds of conversations were happening. And I discovered that what the teachers are doing is they're having these brief, focused Socratic discussions
Mhm.
with their students. And I observed in half-hour periods, and typically these teachers had around 25 students in a class. In half-hour periods, the average number of these short, focused, collegial, respectful conversations of formative assessment around where is the student now? Do they understand the work? Where do they need to go next? The average number in a half an hour was 22.
Wow.
22 conversations, intense, short, focused, purposeful. And it was not unusual to see a child leave that conversation with the teacher and skip back to the place where they were working,
Mhm.
or walk around the classroom a little bit humming and holding their paper out in front of themselves or something. I mean, you could just see from the child's behavior that this had been an affirming experience.
Mhm. It sounds like the child felt understood and really helped to go to another new level on whatever the task was that they were trying to achieve. And that's what was involved in being so happy about it.
I think you're right. And when I'm looking back on that, and that's exactly what I saw. And not once did a teacher berate a child for anything they had done. All
Mhm.
they did was say, I noticed this.
Mhm.
Would you like to check this row of figures here? Because I think there's something kind of missing. You want to go, not like you made the same mistake again,
Mhm.
nothing, not once. There's always a way to phrase it such that it lets the child maintain their sort of position within themselves as a learner who's capable.
Mhm. Mhm. It's so interesting because it sounds like the teachers are very well trained in how to speak like this, but it's not the way that most people are used to talking to each other.
I think that's true. It's very sad. Um, this is one of the places where when people want to be Montessori teachers, the most important thing they have to have is the attitude.
Mhm.
They have to have the belief in the child, and they have to have the attitude, and they have to have the belief in this possibility of this relationship between an adult and a child. And typically, historically, from the development of school as a sort of an institution, teachers were on a pedestal. Teachers were the font of the knowledge. Teachers were they were up front. They had the ruler and the pencil and the grade book, and they knew everything. And in this method, you have to get off the stage.
Mhm.
You have to go to the back of the classroom. You have to go to the side of the classroom. One thing that happens in Montessori classes a lot is that a teacher is in there teaching, and an adult walks into the classroom. And particularly if they don't know anything about Montessori, they'll say, "Where's the teacher? Where is the teacher?" The teacher is down on the floor
Mhm.
working with a child or with children. So the teacher is not running the show. The children start to run the show. They are the ones who monitor each other's behavior and wipe up spills and pick up messes. And it's just part of that whole community of learners. And it's a lovely atmosphere.
And while that teacher is with that student, the other ones are all busy with their own work.
One
And
would hope.
well, it doesn't always happen, but I mean, this is one
Yes.
of the things that adults who aren't familiar with the Montessori classroom will be really surprised at, is that
Yes.
there's not somebody telling the children how to behave or keeping them in one place or anything like that, and yet they're engaged in the work.
I've had visitors to my classroom ask me, and they were only semi joking, if I had a whip in the closet.
What?
Yeah. And years ago, my husband visited Beverly Montessori, where our children went and where I worked. And he managed a huge office. And he was just blown away every time he went in there, said, you could never put adults in that close proximity to one another and expect that anything good was going to happen. There would be no work happening. And yet in this classroom, there were 25 children, busy as little bees, all within each other's space. And the whole thing just worked seamlessly.
Mhm. Because they're doing things where they're feeling so empowered because they're mastering some new knowledge or skill
Yeah,
or interaction, and it's just it's so satisfying to them that they keep
they,
doing it. Again, it's what
yeah,
Montessori called, they become self-disciplined because they want more of that.
yes,
Yeah. So
yeah.
what's the bottom line with, I mean, it sounds like formative assessment is far superior way to make sure that children and anybody actually learns whatever they're trying to learn, because you're giving them feedback all along as they're going along trying to master this new knowledge or skill or whatever it is.
It is it's extremely effective, and doesn't have to be a case of either or. It's not you either do formative assessment or you do summative assessment. Both kinds of assessment are necessary, but the learning educational research has shown that when formative assessment is used in classrooms at all levels, that children learn more faster. They're more engaged with learning, and the classroom community is better. Where it breaks down for teachers in traditional education in particular, according to the literature, is that the teachers will hear about formative assessment. They'll think, well, that sounds nice. I would really like to do that, but they're not given the professional development. They haven't seen it.
Mhm.
They're not coached around it, or if they are coached around it, it's one of these wonderful 1 hour professional development
Right.
opportunities in
Yeah.
September, and
Right.
then boom, teachers will, check that
Right.
box. Yeah, they got their formative assessment training.
Yeah.
But it's for teachers for whom this doesn't come naturally, who were never taught this way, never were taught how to teach this way. They need to learn um, a new approach, and it takes a period of time. And so, there's a whole body of research on effective professional development, and that's what it takes. In the end, it's not one more thing that a teacher has to go do that makes life even more difficult. It actually relieves the burden and makes it easier for teachers.
Mhm.
And when you teach children to self-assess and to assess one another, then you're really striking gold.
Mhm, mhm. You know, it sounds like what you're describing for the teachers is they need to go through a period of formative assessment, a formative assessment in order to learn this new method. In other words, they need to practice and then get feedback about it and practice again and get feedback so that they develop the habits. They not only develop the vocabulary for how to talk to the child, but also the habit of doing it. And you know what it reminds me a lot of the research of Anders Ericsson on peak performance. He has a very interesting book, I think it's called Peak, in which he discusses how somebody can learn things if they do very deliberate practice. And what he means by that is you keep in mind what you're trying to achieve, and you keep looking at what you're doing as you go along and assessing, having tools to assess, well, am I achieving that? And if not, what's going wrong here? And then how can I change what I'm doing? And that's how you end up really mastering things. So,
It's so true. And
yeah.
the educational research on formative assessment bears that out as well, that it's one of the big goals of formative assessment is to make sure that the child understands the end result, the goal of the work. So when a teacher has given a lesson to a student, the student has seen the whole work. Let's say the teacher is showing how to do long division with the test tube division materials, right? The student sees the whole process, so they know that it's possible.
Mhm.
And then if they're mixed up, then the teacher in doing the formative assessment is saying to herself or himself, do I need to give this child this whole entire lesson again, or do they just need one part of this lesson again? Or how is it that I'm going to further cement the idea of the goal in their head?
Mhm.
Because if you don't know where you're going, I think it was Yogi Berra that said, if you don't know where you're going, you're going to wind up someplace else.
Right, right.
Yeah.
It sounds to me like formative and summative assessment should be partners, that you need formative
Yeah.
assessment while you're learning, and then you use summative assessment to make sure that the person covered everything that they needed to learn. So, or for a credential.
Yes,
See how
yeah,
much they improve.
yes,
So,
that's true. There are good uses
yeah.
of summative assessment. If you do too much summative assessment, it takes up learning time. And one of the sad things about data collection these days in schools is often that teachers are required to collect a lot more data than they even have time to use.
Mhm.
And Montessori teachers get into a dilemma, particularly when they're first starting out being teachers. There is so much data that is possible to capture and so many ways to capture it that a teacher can really get overwhelmed. And so the question becomes what's useful, not
Mhm.
what's possible, not, not what is theoretically possible,
Yeah.
what's actually useful.
Yeah. Yeah. I wanted to go back briefly to what you said about when children do self-assessment and how useful that can be. I remember at Council Oak that we had a self-assessment um, tool that we used for students. And it was always so interesting to see how honest the students were about what they knew and what they didn't know. Because we would ask them, were they just introduced to this work? Were they practicing it, or had they mastered it? And they were amazingly honest about it because they weren't being penalized for not being finished with it, and they were actually being encouraged to know where they were in their learning. And it would be interesting to compare. I would compare it with their assessment with what the teacher would assess about them. So that was always very interesting. So, well, I don't want to keep you too long. I wondered if there was anything else you wanted to say about Montessori or the assessment tools or anything. It's open to you at the end here.
Oh, thank you. Well, when I'm asked to speak about Montessori, I always kind of take heart what Montessori said at the beginning of a lecture that she gave in, I think it was 1946. And she said she always got overwhelmed when she was asked to talk about her method because she said it's vast like the ocean or like the desert.
Mhm.
So I take heart from that. I think Montessori is really about Montessori can be thought of when somebody says the word Montessori, it can be the person, Dr. Montessori, it can be the Montessori philosophy, it can be the Montessori curriculum, um, it can be the Montessori materials. It all adds up to an aid to life at whatever the age of the learner, and it all adds up in aiding life. It all adds up to a wonderful opportunity for the person who gets to assist
Mhm.
the learner in taking those next steps toward their full development as a human being.
And it's so satisfying to see them, the children, when they are enjoying what they're doing. It's just delightful. Well,
Yes.
thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. And I hope that the audience finds some of this information useful. I hope so. We'll put a lot of information in the show notes. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Marsha. It was a privilege to be here.